Part 57. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiaorong. Chapter 562. Chapter 559, Take my sword and come to the best box in Yuanyang Tower. Everyone sat down separately. After sitting down, Governor Yu bowed his hands to Tang Ning and said, "It's been a few days since the three adults came to Ezhu. I've just waited to greet you and wash my hands of the three of you today. I didn't entertain you well, and I hope Hai Han." There were only 3 people qualified to participate in this banquet: Tang Ning, Yu Shi Zhongcheng, and Gong Sun Ying, the leader of the Shadow Guards. Censor Zhongcheng smiled and said, "We are here for official business, not for fun. I am being polite to you, sir. Official business is business, etiquette is etiquette, and the etiquette should be observed." Governor Yu looked at them, took out 3 thick envelopes from his sleeves, placed them on the table in front of the 3 of them, and said, "3 of you, coming from afar, this is a small courtesy from me, so please don't refuse." "Your Majesty, you're welcome." Censor Zhongcheng smiled and put the envelope away. Gong Sun Ying directly opened the envelope, looked at a thick stack of 1,000-tael banknotes inside, and threw it back to the governor's desk with an indifferent expression. Of course, Tang Ning couldn't be bribed with 10,000 to 20,000 taels of silver, so he handed it over and said, "No reward for no merit, I'd better take this small gift back." Censor Zhongcheng looked at him and said, "Master Tang, this is the etiquette of Jiangnan, there is no other meaning." Tang Ning looked at him and asked with a smile, "Is this also the etiquette of the Yashitai? The evaluation of anything should not be one-sided, nor should it be generalized. The censor's office has always regarded itself as a clean stream. Tang Ning has seen censors who speak out and give advice for the sake of justice, and has also seen censors like Censor Zhongcheng who are well versed in the etiquette of Jiangnan. What's ridiculous is that the latter is still the second and third in command of Yashitai." Censor Zhongcheng's expression changed slightly, and the expressions of the Ezhu officials present at the banquet were also grim. There are certain rules in the officialdom that are accepted by everyone. Accepting gifts from others naturally means that you are on the same side as them. Tang Ning's move undoubtedly drew a clear line with Ezhu officials. In other words, Ezhu officials were not going to let them go just like that. In other words, given the 2 paths of life and death, he chose the path of death. Yu Sishi was not angry, but smiled and said, "Master Tang is a pure man, but I am a cliché." He picked up the wine glass, poured a glass of wine on his own, and said, "I will punish myself with 1 drink first." He drank the wine in 1 gulp, poured 2 more glasses, picked up one of the glasses, and said, "Master Tang has come a long way. I would like to pay my respects to Master Tang for this glass." At the banquet, some insiders had a strange look in their eyes. After drinking this glass of wine, he will be bedridden within 2 days. First he will feel dizzy and vomit, then he will have difficulty eating and breathing, and finally he will vomit blood and die. So what about the officials in the capital, and what about the deputy ministers in the Ministry of Civil Affairs? The biggest problem for the officials in the capital when they go to the south of the Yangtze River is that it is difficult to adapt to the soil and water of the south of the Yangtze River. He was not the first, nor the last, to die in the south of the Yangtze River because of the acclimatization. Tang Ning looked at the wine in the glass and remained unmoved. Governor Yu waited for a while and asked with a smile, "Does Mr. Tang think that I don't have this face?" "No, no, no." Tang Ning shook her head, took the wine glass from Governor Yu's hand, put the wine glass on the table into his hand, and said, "Master Yu, you took the wrong one. This is the glass you just used." He looked at Governor Yu and said, "Master Yu, please go first." Governor Yu's expression changed slightly and he said, "How come I remember that I didn't take the wrong one?" Tang Ning said seriously, "Master, you really took the wrong one." Governor Yu looked at him, with a trace of suspicion in his eyes. He put the wine glass to his mouth, but his hand suddenly shook and the wine glass fell to the ground and broke into pieces. A look of annoyance appeared on Governor Yu's face. He shook his head and said, "I am really careless." Before he finished speaking, the door to the box was kicked open. Before anyone at the table could react, more than 10 people rushed in from the door and pushed everyone except Tang Ning and the 3 of them to the ground. Lu Tong strode in, looked at Tang Ning, and said solemnly, "We have captured them all, please give instructions, General." Tang Ning looked at him in shock and asked, "What are you doing?" The Hungmen banquet is also a routine. Whether it is the Hungmen banquet hosted by him or the Hungmen banquet hosted by the governor, everyone must be harmonious at the beginning and have an attitude that everything can be discussed. After drinking for 3 times, there is still no discussion. When they got together, he got angry and threw a glass. Lu Tong and others got the signal, broke in, and captured the corrupt officials in Ezhu. This Hungmen banquet ended. But in whose Hungmen banquet did they flip the table without even drinking a glass of wine, even before the food was served, and when everyone was greeting each other in a friendly manner and with smiles? This is too unrefined. Lu Tong was startled and asked, "Didn't the general say that the cup was thrown as a sign? We heard the sound of the cup being thrown and we came in." Tang Ning looked at the wine glass that had fallen to the ground and shattered into pieces. Her lips moved, but in the end she didn't say anything. Lu Tong was indeed acting in accordance with his instructions. This was considered a lack of consideration on his part. He should have agreed with him on some other code at that time. He has to take the blame, and as a boss, he also has to have the courage to admit his mistakes. Governor Yu and others were pushed to the ground, with their faces touching the floor. They were twisted and deformed due to the excessive force. They shouted in shock and anger, "Who are you? Do you want to rebel?" Censor Zhong Cheng, who was frightened by the sudden formation, also came to his senses, looked at Tang Ning, and said angrily, "Master Tang, what are you doing?" Tang Ning looked at him and said innocently, "I said this is a misunderstanding, do you believe it, Lord Qi?" The chief censor naturally didn't believe it. He ambushed so many people here, could it be just for fun? He never thought that at today's banquet, Tang Ning was even more ruthless than the officials of Ezhu, and actually wanted to catch them all in one fell swoop. He looked at Tang Ning and said loudly, "Since it's a misunderstanding, why don't you let these adults go?" Lu Tong looked at Tang Ning, waiting for his instructions. "Tie them all up." Tang Ning looked at Lu Tong, waved his hand, and said, "After all, we're here." He glanced at the chief censor and said, "Catch this guy who is a traitor, accepting bribes, and colluding with local officials." The chief censor's face changed drastically, and he said, "Tang Ning, what do you want to do? Do you want to rebel? You are the ones who want to rebel, right?" Tang Ning walked to the table and opened the wine pot. There was indeed something interesting inside the pot. The wine in the lake was layered. Under normal circumstances, the wine in the lower layer would be poured out. If the lid of the pot was turned at an angle, the wine in the upper layer would be poured out. Tang Ning looked at Governor Yu and smiled, "Sir Yu, your pot is quite big." Governor Yu's face changed drastically, and he said, This is the custom of Ezhu, this pot is called a two-purpose pot." No more talk. Tang Ning turned the lid of the pot to an angle, poured a glass of wine, handed it to him, and said, "Drink this glass of wine, and pretend that what happened today never happened, how about it?" Governor Yu's face turned completely pale. He knew what the consequences would be if he drank this glass of wine. This was the most painful way to die he had ever seen. Obviously, Tang Ning already knew everything. Governor Yu was desperate at this moment, stretched his neck, and said, "Kill me if you have the guts. Kill me, and let's see how you will explain to the court." Okay. Tang Ning nodded, looked at Chen Zhou behind him, and said, "Take my sword." Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 563. Remember it in 1 second and read wonderful novels for free without pop-ups. In fact, officials in the Ministry of Personnel only have supervisory power over local officials in various states and have no disposal power. Those who fail the assessment need to report to the Ministry of Personnel first, and then the Ministry of Personnel will decide whether the official should be dismissed or dismissed, and this is limited to officials below the 5th rank. Those above and including the 5th rank are considered high-ranking officials, and non-emperors have no power to deal with them. Of course, Tang Ning was not included in this restriction. The Shangfang sword is the highest power given by the emperor to a minister. Seeing the sword is like seeing the king. Holding this sword is equivalent to holding Chen Huang in his hand. He can cut whoever he wants, chop whoever he wants, and he does not have to bear any responsibility. Legal liability. Tang Ning asked Chen Zhou to carry Shangfang's sword with him so that it could be easily accessed when needed. Jiang, Chen Zhou respectfully handed over the sword, and Tang Ning casually pulled it out, making a sound of gold and iron. The Ezhu official who was pinned to the ground with a sharp knife couldn't help but tremble when he heard this sound. Before leaving the capital, Your Majesty gave me the sword of Shangfang. It can be used to kill unruly people and punish corrupt officials. As the governor of Ezhu, you live on the salary of the imperial court, but you do not make decisions for the people, do not be loyal to the imperial court, and are greedy for money yin, murdering the imperial official. Tang Ning held the sword, looked at the governor of Ezhu, and said, with these 2 words, I can kill you now. The governor of Ezhu trembled and said in a trembling voice, You can't kill me, this is against the rules. I have shed blood for the court, I have performed meritorious services for your majesty, I want to see the prime minister, I want to see your majesty. You asked for it yourself just now, why are you regretting it now? Tang Ning looked at him, shook her head and said, Don't worry, I tried it. This sword is very sharp. I guarantee that I can cut off the head with 1 strike. I heard people say that as long as the sword is swung fast enough, the prisoner will not feel the pain, so I will try to move as fast as possible. The Ezhu governor opened his mouth wide, but he only felt waves of dizziness. Under the pressure of Tang Ning's momentum, he could not speak at all. What, is it possible that you think it's not decent to behead someone? Tang Ning looked at him, pointed the tip of the sword at his chest, and said, How about stabbing him in from here? This is decent, but it should be very painful. I can't figure out how I'm going to die for a while, Mr. Yu, if you think about it carefully, we can still discuss it. A large amount of cold sweat broke out on Governor Yu's forehead. When Tang Ning picked up the sword and prepared to strike, he simply rolled his eyes and fainted. Tang Ning shook her head, put the sword back, waved her hand and said, Take them all away. Outside the box, the shopkeeper of Yuanyang Tower looked pale as he watched the senior officials of Ezhu being escorted out, his body trembling. When Tang Ning walked up to him, she paused and asked, Are you the manager of Yuanyang House? The shopkeeper trembled and said, Xiao, Xiaoman. Tang Ning looked at Lu Tong and said, Take away the shopkeeper of Yuanyanglu, along with his assistants and attendants. Tonight's food and drinks were provided by Yuanyang House, so it couldn't have anything to do with them. Since he had already done it, he simply did it thoroughly and took them all back for interrogation. After several high-ranking officials in Ezhu were escorted out, there has been chaos in Yuanyang Tower. What happened? Who are they? What happened to Governor Yu? Why was he carried out? Chang Shibijia was also arrested. What happened? There was an uproar in the building when they saw that local officials, who were usually aloof, were now being held like prisoners. I heard that high-ranking officials from Beijing have come to investigate them in the past few days. Could it be that all the dirty things they have done over the years have been discovered? You deserve it. This guy named Yu did the corvée work indiscriminately, and many people died in the mine. This is retribution. The man surnamed Ma is not a good person. Businessmen who treat him with filial piety will be exempted from taxes and reduced taxes. Those who don't respect him will make things difficult for him. Zhao Yuanwei, who made his fortune from lumber in the east of the city, was ruined by him. When the governor and others were escorted back to the governor's house, passers-by on the street stopped to watch with shocked expressions. There were few people on the street at night, but when they walked from Yuanyang Tower to the Yamen Gate, the people who heard the news walked out of their homes one after another. The streets are blocked with water. The governor, chief minister, and Bijia were all arrested. This was an earth-shattering event in Ezhu. The government officials of the governor's office were already under control before Tang Ning and others returned to the government office. In addition, Tang Ning also sent people to mobilize the Ezhu garrison with the token given by Emperor Chen. Wherever this sign goes, it has the power to mobilize 3,000 defenders. The Ezhu defenders do not have 3,000 people. Tang Ning only mobilized 500 people, but it is enough to deal with any situation. The defenders surrounded the governor's mansion, and even the people who didn't know the inside story knew that something terrible had happened. Tang Ning walked into the governor's office. A general walked up to Tang Ning, knelt down on one knee, cupped his fists and said, "Ezhu City Defense Camp, Colonel Dongwu, see General Tang." Tang Ning accepted him as a salute and then said, "Hurry up and summon all the county magistrates in Ezhu and come to the governor's mansion as soon as possible." "Yes." The young general responded and simply turned around and left. After making some more arrangements, Tang Ning took some time off. This time he almost wiped out the governor's yamen. If no measures are taken, Ezhu may fall into chaos. This is not what he wants to see. After doing all this, he looked at Lu Tong and asked, "Where are Sima, the governor of Ezhu, and others?" "Lu Tongdao, I'm in jail for the time being." "Sir, what should we do next?" "Search their homes," Tang Ning said. "After the matter is clear, search all their homes. Separate the confiscated property and money into categories and mark them. Before that, you first look at their families and don't let them. They transfer property." Lu Tong cupped his hands and said, "Yes." Kong Yu, the governor, casually meant nearly 100,000 taels of silver, which shows how wealthy the local officials in Ezhu were, and most of this money was deducted from the National Tax Bank. Part of the money went into the pockets of local officials, another part was used by them to honor officials in the court, and the rest was turned over to the national treasury. Tang Ning could predict that what he did in Ezhu would definitely cause a disturbance in the capital in half a month, causing even Chen Huang a headache. Therefore, he must handle matters in Ezhu beautifully and make every link impeccable. Of course, the most important thing is to give Chen Huang enough benefits so that he can ignore the benefits of other voices in the court. Nothing is more suitable than silver. After giving instructions to Lu Tong, he summoned the junior officials from the Ministry of Civil Affairs and said, "You guys, each have 10 guards to collect evidence of Ezhu officials' embezzlement of mineral and commercial taxes. The more complete the better." Several minor officials looked excited and nodded. "Don't worry, sir, we will definitely complete the task." The crime of corruption is no small matter, but since it has to be dealt with, it must be dealt with thoroughly and all the crimes they have committed must be revealed. Embezzlement of money and taxes, coupled with the murder of a court official, was enough to get a knife in the neck of the Ezhu governor. In the prison, Tang Ning looked at the shopkeeper of Yuanianglu and asked, "Did your Yuanianglu prepare that poisonous wine?" "You governor and others would not admit the murder of the imperial official, so it would be easier to start from here." "Your Excellency, you are unjust." The shopkeeper of Yuanyang Tower knelt on the ground, crying with runny nose and tears. "They sent that wine bottle in advance, and it has nothing to do with our Yuanyang Tower. The villain didn't even know that it was poison." "Liquor." Tang Ning pointed to the sword Chen Zhou was carrying and asked, "Do you know what this is?" The shopkeeper of Yuanianglu said in a trembling voice, "Sword." That's half right. Tang Ning looked at him and said, this Shangfang sword, which kills people without responsibility, was given by the Emperor of Heaven. It can kill corrupt officials at the top and behead unruly people at the bottom. Do you think you are the unruly person? Your Majesty, you have a clear warning. The shopkeeper of Yuanyang Tower looked at him and said sincerely, the poisonous wine was provided by the governor, and the villain was also coerced by him, otherwise he would kill the villain's whole family. He not only wanted to use this poisonous wine to harm the adults. 2 years ago, I also used it to poison a censor. Sir, I have done it to all the villains. Can I be given a lighter sentence? You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 564. Chapter 561 of the main text volume of Ruyi Xiaolang Jun. Leniency will be given to those who confess, and strict punishment will be given to those who resist. As long as the crime is not unforgivable and the crime is extremely heinous, the punishment can be appropriately reduced if the person confesses. Of course, those who participated in the murder of imperial officials, especially the supervisory censor, even if they were not the masterminds, were still guilty of serious crimes. For the sake of his confession, although he could be exempted from the death penalty, he could not escape from the life crime. The local officials in Ezhu were tampering with taxes and money. Considering the general environment in Jiangnan, they could not cure any serious crimes, but murdering the supervisory censor touched the bottom line of the court. Even if Emperor Chen doesn't pursue this matter, the Yashi Yangguan in Beijing will definitely fight with them to the end. In addition, the officials are not easy to mess with. They usually turn a blind eye just because they haven't found an opportunity. After questioning the manager of Yuanyang Tower, Tang Ning returned to her room and wrote a letter to Fang Hong. She would hand it over to him after these people were escorted to Beijing. Ezhu is not a big place, with only 3 counties under its jurisdiction. Within 1 day, all 3 county magistrates arrived. The 3 of them stood in the hall, their faces all pale. Ezhu Governor, Chenchi, and Bijia were all put in jail. This shows what kind of ruthless person the official from the capital is this time. If someone offends him in any way, if you let him go, you might end up like those people. Tang Ning looked at them and asked calmly, do you all know that the governor of Ezhu has been embezzling state taxes and money for many years, bribing the censor, and intending to murder the imperial officials? The 3 of them said in unison, the official knows. Tang Ning looked at them and asked, I have taken down all the officials involved in the Ezhu government office. What do you think about this? The governor's crime is extremely heinous, and he deserves it. Your Excellency handled the situation extremely well, and I admire you. Thank you, sir, for getting rid of this traitor in Ezhu. The situation was stronger than the people. It was obvious that the Ezhu governor was doomed this time, and the 3 of them sided with Tang Ning without hesitation. What Tang Ning is most worried about is that after taking down the high-ranking officials in the state government, the people of Ezhu will mutiny. Although Ezhu is not big, it is easy to suppress it, but if you can save one thing, you will have one less thing to do. If the county government under Ezhu cooperates, they can suppress it. The impact of this matter was minimized. He looked at the 3 of them and said, the governor of Ezhu deserves his punishment. The 3 of you should take this as a warning and stabilize the people in your jurisdiction. If anyone dares to cause chaos and has evil intentions, I will not be lenient. The 3 of them trembled and immediately said, I obey your orders. After reminding the 3 county magistrates, when the 3 left, Chen Zhou knocked on the door, walked in from the outside, and said, Sir, the punishment for Jiangnan West Road has arrived. The Xingguan had a very special status in the Chen state. He did not have much real power in his hands, but he had the responsibility of supervising the officials of the same line. He could directly hand over the documents to the emperor. It could be said to be a sharp sword hanging over the heads of local officials. He made such a big noise in Ezhu, there was no reason not to alert the criminal officer, but I didn't expect him to come so quickly. Tang Ning walked into the side hall and saw someone standing in the hall. After being stunned for a moment, she said, "Mr. Song, why is it you?" The middle-aged man standing in the hall was no stranger to him. Tang Ning had met Song Qian, the former Jingdong Road prisoner, when he was in Lingzhou. Song Qian looked at him and said with a wry smile, "It is indeed Mr. Tang." Tang Ning ordered Chen Zhou to serve tea. After he sat down, he asked, "Why are you here, Mr. Song?" "Song Qiandao, a year ago, I was transferred to Jiangnan West Road. This time I happened to be near Ezhu. After hearing the news, I rushed over immediately." He looked at Tang Ning and said with a complex expression, "Mr. Tang, do you know that if you take the Ezhu officials, it will be very difficult for you to walk in the south of the Yangtze River? It will not be easy for you to explain to the court. Strictly speaking, you have no once the news of your power to capture the governor of Ezhu reaches the capital, it will become the reason for those people to attack you." Tang Ning had actually thought of this before taking action. The purpose of attacking Ezhu first was to scare the other states and scare the other states. During this trip to Jiangnan, he had only one mission, which was to find out the rebel forces in Jiangnan and eliminate them in one fell swoop. In order to ensure the success of this mission, no matter who or what their purpose is, anyone who causes trouble for this operation will be directly eliminated. Song Yi seemed to have something in his words. Tang Ning looked at him and asked, "Master Song, what do you mean?" Book of Wanman. Song Yi stroked his beard and said with a smile, "As long as Mr. Tang conveys the public opinion of Ezhu to the capital, he can stop the mouths of those in the capital." Tang Ning smiled and said, "Thank you, Mr. Song, for reminding me. The situation in Jiangnan is complicated. Even though I can't stand the actions of these people, I don't dare to act rashly." Song Yi looked at him and said, "In the next period of time, I will stay in Ezhu to assist Master Tang. Deal with the follow-up matters." "Thank you, Mr. Song." Tang Ning could no longer delay in Ezhu. Some of the subsequent chores needed to be handled by a trustworthy person. Song Yi waved his hand and said, "Mr. Tang, you are too polite. You have done something that I have always wanted to do but did not dare to do. In comparison, what does what I have done count?" Several major events happened in Ezhu in the past 2 days. The first incident was, of course, the governor of Ezhu, Sima, Chenchi and other officials. They were captured and imprisoned by high-ranking officials from the capital. This really caused a major earthquake in the officialdom of Ezhu. For a time, Ezhu officials were panicked, and this incident spread to all directions at an extremely fast speed. The second thing is that the governor's office was open for 5 consecutive days. All the people in Ezhu who had been oppressed by these officials could beat the drum to file a complaint, detail their grievances, and sign their names in the book of the people. For this matter, the people of Ezhu responded one after another. A long queue formed in front of the yamen early in the morning and did not disperse until the yamen closed at night. The next morning, the queues of people seeking justice would reappear. The third thing was that the property of several officials, including the governor of Ezhu, was confiscated. It is said that the silver taels confiscated added up to a huge amount of 1 million, and various jewelry, gold and silver filled dozens of large boxes. The people talked about it. These corrupt officials are so rich. Is the court's salary so much? Salary, their salary for hundreds of years is not so much, isn't it all extorted from the people's fat and blood? 1 million taels, we can't make so much money in 10 lifetimes. Only 1 million taels. Tang Ning looked at Lu Tong and frowned slightly. Lu Tong said, "My lord, 1 million taels is real silver, and the other treasures, jewelry, antiques, calligraphy and paintings, add up to an unknown value." Silver is something that can really give people a visual impact. Although 1 million taels is already a huge sum of money, Emperor Chen is not a poor emperor now, and this money can't bring him enough impact. Tang Ning thought about it and said, let someone change all the silver notes into silver and pack them in boxes. The two big objects can also be treated as silver. Those treasures and antiques are stolen goods and are difficult to handle, but the visual impact is much greater when silver notes are changed into silver. Some things that can't be taken away can also be pawned on the spot. Lu Tong nodded and said, my lord, they also found out that some merchants in Ezhu colluded with the government to evade taxes. Tang Ning's eyes lit up and said, fine, according to the law, let them pay 5 times the amount back. Remember to pay all silver, not silver notes. Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 565. Chapter 562, Impeachment. Ezhu is really not peaceful these days. Following several high-ranking officials in Ezhu, some wealthy businessmen in Ezhu are also in trouble. Over the years, they have opened up channels up and down, bribed officials, and recorded only half or less of the total amount of goods placed in the official treasury for tax registration, so that they can pay at least half of the commercial tax. This time, the high-ranking officials from the capital found out the problem on the spot. After counting the goods in the official warehouse, and comparing them with the cargo manifest, their tricks were revealed. It doesn't matter if they are found to have evaded taxes. Officials from the capital will not treat them like the governor of Ezhu and Bijia, who will put them in shackles and be put in a prison car and escorted to the capital for questioning. As long as they pay all the taxes and fines they owe, nothing will happen. But it is not easy to pay all the money. According to the laws of Chen State, merchants who evade taxes will be fined 5 times the tax, and the government has set a rule for them to pay the money in full for 5 years at a time. This is mandatory, even if businessmen who have colluded with the government for less than 5 years have to hold their noses and admit it. The consequence of disobeying the law is to confiscate your home. You governor and others have learned from the past. No one wants to follow their old path. However, what they didn't understand was that the government only wanted silver, not silver notes. Obviously, silver notes were much easier to carry than silver coins. The orders from above are non-negotiable. If you want money, they have to give it. For a time, the merchants involved in the Ezhu incident were going crazy in collecting silver taels from all over the place. Some of them were fined with huge amounts of silver and could not afford that much silver. They were even willing to exchange full amount silver notes for insufficient silver taels. I would rather suffer some losses and raise the money within 3 days. Facts have once again proven that force is the easiest way to solve problems. The governor of Ezhu and others have been put into prison cars and are about to be transported to the capital together with their property and the tax money paid by Ezhu merchants. They took a long detour from the capital to Ezhu, and it only took more than half a month. It should be faster to go back, and the silver will appear in front of Chen Huang in half a month at the latest. This time, the property of several officials in Ezhu and the tax money paid by Ezhu businessmen totaled more than 3 million taels. These more than 3 million taels are not bank notes, they are all real money. Although the visual impact is a bit greater, with some other things, the total adds up to more than 100 carriages, making transportation inconvenient. Tang Ning stood on the street, looking at the endless motorcade, and couldn't help but lick her lips. More than 3 million taels. He had to take the first prize 3 times before Tang Yejing could earn so much. The total assets of their family now must be more than 3 million taels, but the cash is far less than that. It was the first time for him to see such a battle. When he took a look at the box full of silver, he felt there will be an irresistible impulse. Tang Ning looked away and couldn't bear to look anymore. Song Qian stood beside him and asked, Master Tang, I am afraid that there will be chaos in the capital this time. Do you want to write a letter first and send it to the capital immediately so that your majesty can be prepared? No need. Tang Ning shook her head and said, I plan to give his majesty a surprise and let this envelope travel for a few more days. The key to surprise is to be unexpected. A surprise that is notified in advance is not a surprise. Moreover, before these things are transported to the capital, there must be some news that will arrive before them. It is better to let the evil spirits in the court reveal their true colors first, so that when he returns to the capital, he will not have to guess one by one. The defenders of Ezhu could not leave Ezhu, and the only people escorting the convoy were officials from Ezhu. Tang Ning specially sent 10 members of the Blade to follow in case something unexpected happened on the road. Thinking about it, nothing will happen. After all, this is 3 million taels, not 300,000 taels. If any gang of bandits dares to touch the money, Emperor Chen is afraid that he will send an army to level their mountains. Just like no thief dares to plan for urgent letters from the government, anyone who has the ability to touch the money will not be so brainless. Tang Ning handed the 2 letters to the sharp-edged team leader and said, after returning to the capital, give one of these 2 letters to Fang Hong, the Minister of Staff, and the other to General Xiao Lang. The squad leader bowed and said, yes. Tang Ning waved her hand and said, let's go. The squad leader turned around and shouted, let's go. The distance from Ezhu to the capital is neither close nor far. For ordinary people, it would take less than half a month to travel at a normal speed, but if you hurry up, you can get there in 3 days. At this time, several days had passed since the Ezhu rebellion. From the capital, a fast horse galloped from the official road in the distance, raising smoke and dust all the way, and stopped in a hurry when it reached the city gate. After he entered the city, he went straight to a high gate somewhere. A moment later, in a deep courtyard, a middle-aged man slammed the table and said angrily, what are you talking about? The Ezhu governor, Sima, the governor, have all been captured. The man nodded and said, when the villain set out from Ezhu, I heard that the man was going to take them to the capital for questioning. I am afraid they will arrive in the capital within 10 days. The middle-aged man became gloomy, strode out of the house, and said, prepare the sedan and go to the Tang family. In the Tang mansion, Tang Hui and Tang Qi returned home from the Yamen after receiving the news. The latter frowned and said, he captured all the high-ranking officials in Ezhu, including the censor Zhong Cheng. The middle-aged man said, I just got the news. Officials from the Ministry of Personnel have never done this before when they went to Jiangnan. Could this be instructed by your majesty? Impossible. Tang Qi shook his head and said, I heard that there were several rebels in Jiangnan. Your majesty sent him this time, probably for this matter. If your majesty really wanted to move Jiangnan, he would have done it long ago. The middle-aged man said, so, he made his own decision in this matter. He smiled and said, if so, isn't this our chance? What's the hurry? Tang Hui glanced at him and said, just spread the news. You don't have to do anything else. Someone will do what you want to do. The middle-aged man was stunned, and his face showed a look of sudden realization. There are many officials from Jiangnan in the court, and there are even more officials who are closely connected with Jiangnan. They may not have the same political views, but sometimes they will unite and work together. Tang Ning's move this time affected the interests of all of them, and it will definitely cause fierce criticism from officials in Jiangnan. Among the many parties in the court, the Jiangnan faction has the largest number of people and the greatest power. In many cases, even His Majesty has to compromise. Can Tang Ning defeat the Jiangnan party alone? Can he be the enemy of one person, but not the enemy of 10,000 people? The middle-aged man looked at Tang Hui and smiled, I understand. The officials of the Chen kingdom have to attend the morning court almost every day, because His Majesty is diligent in government affairs and rarely slackens off. However, the time of the morning court varies, from several hours to less than a quarter. Most of the time, Several major events are discussed in the court, and it will not take long to leave. In the past half month, there are two major events discussed in the morning court. One is the grassland. The Wanyan tribe has become more and more powerful in the past year. The Jiagu and Chuhu tribes secretly supported by Chen Chu can no longer stop their expansion. Once the Wanyan tribe annexed these two tribes, they will be invincible on the grassland. The next target is Chen Chu. Second, the western regions. The speed of Zioan's rise in the western regions is faster than that of the Wanyan tribe. In half a year, two more western regions' powers have been annexed by them. If this continues, the west of Chen will face great pressure. If Zioan develops a rebellious heart, it will become a great enemy of Chen. The court officials discussed these two matters for half a month, but they could not come to a conclusion. Emperor Chen looked at the noisy court, rubbed his eyebrows, waved his hand, and said, "This matter will be discussed tomorrow. If there is something, please report it. If there is nothing, please leave the court." As soon as he finished speaking, an official walked out of the crowd, holding a tablet, and said in a deep voice, "I impeach Tang Ning, the left Xiao Ei Zonglang Jiang and the Deputy Minister of the Ministry of Personnel, for taking advantage of the inspection and assessment to act arbitrarily, exceed his authority, and cause chaos in the local area. Fortunate young gentleman." Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 566. Ruyi Xiaolang Jun Text Volume Chapter 563. The one who stood out was the Li Ke Shizhong. The responsibilities of the Li Ke Shizhong were similar to those of the censor, but more professional and specific. The person responsible for a specific one of the 6 departments was one piece. In the affairs of the Ministry of Personnel, it is the duty to supervise whether officials in the Ministry of Personnel have neglected their duties. The person he impeached was not simple. Although Tang Ning was not the real Minister of Civil Affairs, he was the Emperor's favorite, and his power was still higher than that of the Minister of Civil Affairs. Being arbitrary is a taboo in official examinations, and overstepping one's authority is even more taboo. As for causing trouble to the local area, if this label is implemented, I am afraid that he will be recalled to the capital immediately for questioning. Li Ke continued in the matter. Tang Ning, the Deputy Minister of the Ministry of Civil Affairs, arrested and imprisoned Ezhu Governor, Bijia, Chinchi, Sima, and other officials without the permission of the imperial court. This caused widespread resentment and panic among the people in Ezhu. I sincerely request your Majesty to immediately, it is not too late, to recall him to the capital for accountability and send another official to take the Jiangnan Road exam. Many officials in the court still didn't know what Li Ke was impeaching Tang Ning for, but after hearing what he said, they knew better. The situation in Jiangnan was clearer to each official in the DPRK and central government. No one from the capital who was sent to Jiangnan dared to interfere in the affairs of Jiangnan. But this time they happened to encounter a broom star who was fearless, and they could only admit that they were unlucky. Ezhu is not big, but many people know it. One of the several large copper mines in Chen State is in Ezhu. The imperial court tried to raise mining taxes many times, but was blocked by Jiangnan officials. There was naturally something fishy about it. It was no accident that Ezhu local officials fell into Tang Ning's hands this time. But similarly, some people in the court would not let him go so easily. Even if the Ezhu officials were convicted, many officials representing the interests of Jiangnan would seize on him and recall him from Jiangnan first. After Li Ke spoke up about the matter, several officials came forward to second their opinions. Such situations where several officials impeach someone at the same time must have been discussed in advance, and the officials who came forward were either from Jiangnan or had close ties with Jiangnan. Several censors in Taishung were filled with indignation because Tang Ning not only arrested Ezhu officials, but also captured the censor Zhong Cheng and sent him back to the capital. This was a naked trampling on the dignity of the censor. Several senior officials signed a petition to remonstrate, but Chen Wang's expression was quite indifferent. He looked down and said, I am tired today. This matter will be discussed at the next court meeting. After saying that, he stood up and left from the back hall. After the court meeting dispersed, Fang Hong walked out of the hall, and Sun Qian, the right servant of the Ministry of Personnel, rushed over from behind, shook his head and said, Master Fang, what should we do? What Tang Ning was doing in who was acting as the minister of the Ministry of Personnel. As a result, the Ministry of Personnel suffered a lot of attacks in the palace just now. Shang Shizhou was ill, so the affairs of the Ministry of Personnel naturally fell into the hands of their two ministers. On the head, Fang Hong said, Master Tang is not a person who ignores the important and the important. He must have his own reasons for doing this. We only need to wait for those criminals to arrive in the capital, and everything will come to light. Sun Qian nodded and said, I also believe that Mr. Tang is not that kind of person, but he may be in big trouble this time. After Sun Qian finished speaking, he sighed and said, it would be okay if Mr. Tang is in the capital. With his ability, officials from the Jiangnan faction may not be able to do anything to him, but if he is far away in Jiangnan, he will not be able to control the situation in the capital. Fang Hong smiled and said, Master Sun still doesn't understand Master Tang. Even if he is far away in the south of the Yangtze River, those people in the capital can't stand him. What we really need to worry about is them. The two of them walked out of the palace gate and went straight to the official office. At the same time, in a carriage on the street, Tang Qi looked at a middle-aged man and said, he jumped into this muddy water in the south of the Yangtze River himself. Now that he has jumped in, he should not come out again. A smile appeared on the middle-aged man's face, and he said, My lord, this trick of borrowing a knife to kill someone is really wonderful. On the Ezhu side, it was thanks to Feng Xiang's relationship. He disrupted Ezhu, Feng Xiang, and the people around him. Can you let him go easily? Tang Qi shook his head and said, all this depends on your majesty. The middle-aged man smiled and said, don't you understand your majesty's temperament, Mr. Tang? Unless he can obtain huge and unimaginable benefits, otherwise, your majesty will not watch the court fall into chaos. Tang Ning will never see him again, it's so powerful. Only one person can defeat half of Jiangnan. He looked at Tang Qi, narrowed his eyes, and said, if Prime Minister Feng and his party can give His Majesty a stable court, what can Tang Ning give to His Majesty? For your Majesty, what is more important than the stability of the court? In the royal study, after Emperor Chen went to court, he would usually come directly to the imperial study to handle political affairs. However, this time, he did not review the memorials. Instead, he frowned and paced slowly in the palace. He knew about the matter in Ezhu yesterday, and he also expected that in today's morning court, officials from the Jiangnan faction would hold on to the matter, and he was already mentally prepared for this. What he was worried about was not that the Jiangnan faction was causing rebellion in the court. What he was worried about was whether those Jiangnan rebels had penetrated into Ezhu. Although Ezhu is located on the west road of Jiangnan, it is also on the edge of the two south roads of the Yangtze River. It is not very far from the capital. It can be reached within a few days of urgent march. If even Ezhu is infiltrated by the rebels, will this Jiangnan still be the Jiangnan of Chen's country? But if it weren't for those rebels, why would Tang Ning go to war to kill all the high-ranking officials in Ezhu? He wouldn't be fool. Now the grassland situation has changed again. The Wanyan tribe is about to unify the grassland. The speed of annexation and expansion of the country of Zioan in the western region is astonishing. In less than 2 years, all the territory outside Shazhu is theirs. In ancient times, whenever the western region became powerful, there would be wars with the central plains. Ambition will always expand with the expansion of territory. Just at this time, Jiangnan is in chaos again. Chen's state seems to be bright on the surface, but in fact it has internal and external troubles. In this situation, Some ministers in the court do not think about how to govern the country and strengthen the army. They only know how to form gangs and fight against dissidents. They only have their own interests in mind. They are like termites attached to the court, absorbing the nutrients of the country and strengthening themselves. Once Chen state changes in the future and changes to a new dynasty, although the Zhao dynasty is dead, they can still be their high officials. Bang! A hint of sharpness gradually appeared on the face of Emperor Chen, and he punched the table, scaring the eunuchs who served beside him to turn pale. "Your Majesty, don't be angry." Wei Jian stepped forward and said, "Lord Tang has always been trustworthy in his work. When he comes back from Ezhu, everything will be clear." "I do believe him." Emperor Chen breathed a sigh of relief and said, "But even the court officials got the news, but he didn't send anyone to send a letter back to explain to me. Is he too disdainful to explain, or is he planning to give me a surprise when the time comes?" After the news from Ezhu reached the capital, the already restless court was stirred up again. Everyone knows that the Jiangnan faction headed by Feng Xiang has always been very protective of the interests of Jiangnan. This time, Tang Ning's actions in Ezhu have undoubtedly angered this group. According to insiders, they have united dozens of officials in the court, listed Tang Ning's 10 major crimes, and waited to directly attack Your Majesty at the morning court the next day. However, before the next day, news came from the palace. Your Majesty is ill and will be absent for 10 days. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 567. Chapter 564 of the text volume of Ruyi Little Man, recalling Jiangnan West Road governs 19 prefectures. In just a few days, what happened in Ezhu has spread to more than 10 prefectures. Officials such as Ezhu's governor, Bijia, and Chenchi were imprisoned, and even their property was confiscated. The wealthy businessmen in the state were fined a large amount of tax money before they were able to be safe. When officials from various states heard the news, they were in disbelief at first. After confirming it, they suddenly became frightened. In the entire Jiangnan West Road, the governor of Ezhu can be regarded as a ruthless kind. Many of the officials who went to Jiangnan suffered losses at his hands, but even he fell into the hands of others, let alone those whose means were inferior to his. After the Ezhu incident, officials from various states in the south of the Yangtze River knew that a ruthless character might really come to the capital this time. Officials in the south of the Yangtze River are fearless if they are magnanimous in their hearts. Those who have ghosts in their hearts burn incense and worship Buddha. They hope that their backers in the capital can work hard as soon as possible to recall that person to the capital to question the crime. After all, although this is Jiangnan, the other party, it seems that they have military power. Even if they are local snakes, they dare not fight with the opponent with real swords and guns. Whether they are beaten or not is another matter. The other party is a Beijing official with a sacred mandate. They use secret methods to be okay. As long as their hands and feet are clean, they can sit back and relax. But once the war breaks out openly, it is a real rebellion. If this charge is taken, even if you have 9 lives, you will have to take part in it. Hearing that the man had left Ezhu and was about to go to another state capital, people all over the south of the Yangtze River were panicked. It has been several days since Tang Ning left Ezhu. In the past few days, they have traveled through 3 more states. The situation in these 3 states is different from Ezhu. Although there are indeed some problems in the state, they are not as serious as Ezhu. The most important thing is that the attitudes of the officials in these 3 states are extremely good, and they are extremely cooperative with the investigations of the officials. If the governor of Ezhu had the same attitude at the time, instead of secretly doing evil things, maybe he is still in Ezhu now, instead of he was locked in a prison car and watched the scenery along the way from Ezhu to the capital. After all, The purpose of his trip to Jiangnan this time was not to take exams. If the other party looked at him, he would not treat him like the governor of Ezhu. However, he did not tolerate tax issues. Once a businessman was found to have committed tax evasion and other acts, he would immediately impose a fine of 5 times the amount of silver and a fine of 5 years at a time. All he needed was silver and no banknotes. After the tax was paid, he would be fined. It will be shipped to the capital. As for the officials involved, corresponding evaluations will naturally be given during the assessment, and the Ministry of Personnel will make the final decision. Jiangnan West Road, Hangzhou. Tang Ning has stayed in Hangzhou for 3 days. He has not found any major problems in Hangzhou and is preparing to leave for Reizhou today. The governor of Hangzhou and others escorted him out of the city and said with a smile on his face, "Lord Tang, go slowly." This smile is a smile from the heart. When this adult from the capital leaves, each of them is happy in their hearts. The incident in Ezhu almost made the officials in Jiangnan states become frightened when they heard about Tang Ning. Before he was about to arrive in Hangzhou, the officials in Hangzhou did not let go of their worries. After he arrived in Hangzhou, everyone was even more careful with him at all times, for fear that he would put them in jail and have their homes ransacked in his anger. Surprisingly, Mr. Tang, who did such a big thing in Ezhu, does not seem to be as vicious as imagined. The examinations in Hangzhou were quite satisfactory, and Hangzhou officials did not suffer any particular difficulties. It seems that Ezhu is just a way for him to scare the monkeys. After all, if he really makes the 2 roads south of the Yangtze River uneasy, he will not be able to explain it to the imperial court. After leaving Hangzhou and going further south, you will reach Reizhou. After passing Reizhou and going further south, you will reach Jiangnan East Road, which is also the destination of Tang Ning's trip. There are more than a dozen states in Jiangnan West Road, and Tang Ning handed them over to several officials. Now in Jiangnan West Road, the states are afraid of hearing about the officials. Except for Ezhu, the attitude of the officials in other state capitals is acceptable. They should not. What obstacles will you encounter again? Before getting on the carriage, he looked back at Chenzhou and asked, how many days have it been since they set off from Ezhu? Chenzhou thought for a while and said, tomorrow will be 10 days. From Ezhu to the capital, 10 days is enough if there are no detours. In the past 10 days, the capital must have been very lively. After those things were transported to the capital, it would be even more lively. It was a pity that he was far away in the south of the Yangtze River and could not see this lively scene. The capital has been quite peaceful these days, but even ordinary people can detect the undercurrents surging beneath the tranquility. The reason for the calm was that His Majesty announced a 10-day break from court on the grounds of physical illness. No matter how much dissatisfaction some officials had, they had nowhere to express it. Of course, everyone knows that His Majesty is not really ill, but is trying to escape. Tang Ning is his favorite, and His Majesty's trust in him cannot be increased. He is entrusted with all important matters, so naturally he does not want to punish him. And even do not hesitate to use such methods to escape. At this time, the court had been suspended for nearly 10 days, and the voices in the court regarding recalling Tang Ning to the capital to face charges not only did not weaken, but actually increased. Due to His Majesty's evasive behavior, the officials in Jiangnan quickly accumulated dissatisfaction with Tang Ning. Now, it is not limited to Ezhu. Shangsha Province. Li Ke looked at an old man during the incident and said, Tang Ning is lawless in Jiangnan and causing trouble to the place. Is it necessary for the imperial court to just watch like this? The old man was reviewing the memorial and said without raising his head, when they come back from Jiangnan, it will be clear whether the Ezhu officials are guilty or whether Tang Ning, the acting minister of the Ministry of Rights, caused trouble to the place. Li Kiki Shizhong continued, even if the Ezhu officials are guilty, Tang Ning is just a deputy minister of the Ministry of Civil Affairs. What authority does he have to perform duties on behalf of the imperial court and his majesty? The old man said, "Didn't your majesty give him the Shangfang sword?" Li Ke looked at the old man in the matter, his tone suddenly changed, and said, "But think about it, Mr. Feng, since the founding of Chengguo, who else has been given the Shangfang sword?" The old man paused while flipping through the memorial. After thinking about it carefully, he frowned. The sword of Shangfang is the highest power given by the king to his ministers. It can also be said that the ministers exercise their royal power on behalf of the emperor. The sword of Shangfang cannot be easily taught to others. Since the founding of the Chen kingdom, Tang Ning was the first to receive this honor among several generations of emperors. Li Ke noticed the change in the old man's expression during the incident, and struck a chord while the iron was hot. In ancient times, anyone who has been favored by the emperor, who relies on favor and is arrogant, and who regards the law as nothing, is not a sycophant. This person disturbs the imperial court internally and causes trouble in the place externally. Your Majesty was blinded by him. Because of him, he ignored the opinions of the ministers and did not hesitate to stop the court for 10 days. If he continues, the court will be in chaos. The old man put down the memorial with a thoughtful look on his face. He is the right minister of the government and has to deal with many national affairs every day. There is no reason for him to pay special attention to a deputy minister of the Ministry of Personnel and several ASHU officials. But as a king, for the sake of a minister, he treated the morning court as a child's play and stayed away from court for 10 days, which was a bit too indulgent. There is a saying in Li Ke's story that is right. A concubine who is favored by the emperor will bring trouble to the court, let alone an important minister who holds great power. Whenever someone gets the special favor of the emperor, it is the beginning of great chaos in Chaogang and the overthrow of Guozhou. He thought for a while and said, "Hurry to the south of the Yangtze River and summon Tang Ning, the acting minister of the Ministry of Personnel, back to the capital." Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 568. Chapter 565 of the text volume of Ruyi Little Man, the ASHU discussion that had been stagnant for more than 10 days after arriving in Beijing, finally made new progress today. When the right minister of the court personally made the decision, he sent an envoy to the south of the Yangtze River and called Tang Ning, the deputy minister of the Ministry of Personnel, back to Beijing to investigate the crime. The 6 ministries were under the jurisdiction of the Shaanxi province. The only people in the court who could make this decision, besides Your Majesty, were the 2 prime ministers, King Feng. However, before this order even left the capital, it was stopped by a decree from the palace. His Majesty personally issued an order to deny Prime Minister Feng's decision. The envoy was urgently recalled before he could reach the city gate. As soon as this incident came out, the entire capital was in an uproar. Although the relationship between the emperor and the prime minister is that of principal ministers, they also restrict each other. Many of His Majesty's decrees will be opposed by the prime minister, and the prime minister does not need to ask for Your Majesty's decision. Generally, it is not a big deal, and Your Majesty will rarely object explicitly. This decree made the monarch and his subjects completely on opposite sides. Prime Minister Feng has been in power for many years, and many officials from the Jiangnan faction have followed him. If he stands on the opposite side of His Majesty, a group of people will stand on the opposite side of His Majesty. Situations like this have been common for many years. There have been many instances where monarchs and ministers fought over the Golden Palace and became red-faced and embarrassed. Prime Minister Feng even threatened to resign several times. Of course, even if the emperor and his ministers had different political opinions and had many disputes, after so many years, Prime Minister Feng was still Prime Minister Feng. If the emperor dismissed the prime minister because of these things, he would not leave anything good in the history books. Those with a keen sense of smell have already sensed the unusual atmosphere permeating the capital. Many officials have even foreseen the situation in which the emperor and his ministers will compete with each other in the morning court tomorrow. Shaanxi Province. The Ministry of Personnel has the rules of the Ministry of Personnel. The officials who are examined by the Ministry of Personnel have only the right to take exams. As for whether they pass the exam and how to deal with it, the Ministry of Personnel has its own decision. A deputy minister of the Ministry of Civil Affairs is not qualified to arrest the governor of a state and escort him back to the capital. This is trespassing, and trespassing is also a taboo in officialdom. The minister's decision to recall Tang Ning was reasonable, but His Majesty's actions were a bit overly protective. Prime Minister Feng looked extremely ugly. His Majesty rejected the order to summon Tang Ning back to the capital. This was the first time since he became Prime Minister that His Majesty opposed his reasonable decision without any reason. And this is just for a controversial Deputy Minister of the Ministry of Civil Affairs. He looked out the window and said, Zhonglang General Zhou Xiaoyi, Deputy Minister of the Ministry of Civil Affairs, this person already has the prototype of a favored minister and a fawning minister. This is a precursor to chaos in the court and the world. Li Ke looked at Prime Minister Feng during the incident and knew His Majesty's actions, which strengthened Prime Minister Feng's decision to get rid of Tang Ning. When it comes to the matter of Ezhu alone and the interests of Jiangnan, Prime Minister Feng may not be too serious. His Majesty's attitude of trying to protect him made Prime Minister Feng really vigilant. Since ancient times, no dynasty in which the emperor ignored his ministers and only favored one person lasted long. The Prime Minister happens to have the responsibility to maintain the long-term stability of the dynasty. Li Ke looked at him in Shizhong and said respectfully, the Prime Minister has a wise eye. After Li Ke left the matter, Feng Xiang looked at another person in the hall and said, tomorrow in the court, I plan to admonish you to clean up the traitors. What does Wang Xiang think? His words were both a question and an invitation. If the two prime ministers agreed, even the king could not have his own way. Wang Xiang took a sip of tea and said leisurely, Your Majesty is Your Majesty after all. Above the court and in front of all the civil and military officials, Prime Minister Feng still has to save some face for His Majesty. Feng Xiang shook his head and said, Your Majesty has been blinded by the sycophant. It is my duty to prevent Your Majesty from going too far astray. The future of Chen state is more important than Your Majesty's face. Thinking of the situation in the palace tomorrow, Wang Xiang coughed and said, Tomorrow an old friend will travel far away. I want to send him out of the capital, so the palace will be handed over to Prime Minister Feng. After he finished speaking, he stood up and walked out of the hall. When he reached the door, he suddenly stopped in his steps. He turned around and asked, seemingly unintentionally, is Prime Minister Feng doing this just to get rid of the traitors? Feng Xiang looked at him, frowned and asked, Does Wang Xiang think that I have any other plans that I can't succeed in? Wang Xiang smiled and said, Just ask casually, Xiang Feng doesn't need to worry too much. After that, he walked straight out, leaving Feng Xiang alone in the hall. His expression changed for a while, and finally turned into indifference. Royal Palace, in the Royal Garden. The Queen Mother was walking with Emperor Chen. At a certain moment, she turned her head to look at him and asked, Is the court encountering another difficulty? Chen Huang smiled and said, It's a little thing. It must be because of Prime Minister Feng. The Queen Mother looked at him and said, The AI family has heard from Manor that because of the incident in Ezhu, Prime Minister Feng took the lead in making trouble in the court. Chen Wang's tone was very indifferent and said, Then let him make trouble. This is not the first time anyway. I just can't hear it. Prime Minister Feng made your father very angry back then. The Queen Mother smiled and said, But he has indeed done some practical things for the court in recent years, and he is also very capable. These officials in the court, how can there be a perfect person? He has done more practical things for Jiangnan. Chen Huang frowned and said, These officials in Jiangnan only think about themselves. The national treasury has been empty in recent years. How could they have thought about me or the court? If it weren't for Tangning, the national treasury would have been empty. The past 2 years have been a little more prosperous, but I can't even afford the money for the Queen Mother's birthday. The Queen Mother looked at him and said, "Your Majesty seems to like the little guy named Tang very much." Emperor Chen said without hesitation, "He rarely disappoints me in the things I entrusted to him. From the beginning, I trained him as a good minister. In the past 2 years, he has been in the 6 ministries and has done a lot of great things, which also proves that my vision is correct." The Queen Mother looked at him and asked, "This time, the Ezhu incident was also caused by him, right?" Emperor Chen nodded and said, "Something happened in Jiangnan. I asked him to take a look. I don't know if the Ezhu officials are related to this matter, which made him so fuss." He and the Queen Mother walked out of the imperial garden. There was an eunuch waiting outside the imperial garden. He whispered, "Your Majesty, the Ezhu criminals sent by Lord Tang have just arrived in Beijing." Emperor Chen asked, "Are you back?" The eunuch nodded and said, "The messenger sent by Lord Tang is already waiting at the door of the imperial study." After a while, Emperor Chen walked into the imperial study, looked at a person below, and asked, "Tell me what happened in Ezhu." The Sharp Blade team leader knelt on one knee and said, "Your Majesty, Lord Tang was ordered by the Emperor to inspect Jiangnan. When he arrived in Ezhu, he found that local officials in Ezhu had embezzled mining taxes for many years, and there was collusion between officials and businessmen to falsify commercial taxes. Lord Tang also found out that local officials in Ezhu were so bold that they had murdered officials appointed by the court, and there were witnesses and evidence." As he spoke, Emperor Chen's face became more and more gloomy. He knew that officials in Jiangnan were bold, but he didn't know they were so bold that they openly murdered officials from Beijing who went to Jiangnan to investigate. Captain Li Jian continued to report, "Lord Tang arrested several criminal officials including the governor of Ezhu, confiscated their property, and ordered Ezhu merchants to pay the taxes owed, totaling 3,127,000 taels of silver, and rare jewels of unknown value, all of which have been transported to the capital and handed over to your Majesty for disposal." Humph, a small Ezhu can actually have three. Emperor Chen didn't finish his words, his expression froze, and he looked at him suddenly. "How much did you say?" Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 569. The tax money collected by Chengguo's treasury last year was only 12 million taels, and 2 years ago, it was less than 10 million taels. Therefore, when hearing the number reported by the leader of the Sharp Blade team, Chen Huang subconsciously thought it was 30,000 or 300,000 taels. A small Ezhu could collect 3 million taels of silver. He did not even dare to dream of this. Think. When His Majesty asked, the captain of the Sharp Blade team had to repeat, the properties of Ezhu governor, Bijia and other officials, as well as the tax money paid by Ezhu merchants, totaled more than 3 million taels. The remaining rare jewelry is estimated to be worth 2 million. 2. A total of 5 million taels. 5 million taels of silver is enough to cover half a year's tax money for the treasury. Chen Huang walked forward quickly and said, "Take me to have a look." The prisoners in Ezhu were temporarily escorted to the Dali Temple Tianlao, and more than 100 carriages slowly drove into the palace city. On a square in the palace, Chen Huang looked at the endless motorcade in front of him and waved, "Open all the boxes." A team of guards stepped forward and tore off the seal of the box on the car. The moment they opened the lid, they were almost blinded by a silver light. There were more than 100 carriages and hundreds of boxes filled with silver, making everyone feel that the surroundings were much brighter. Although the imperial guards in the palace were used to seeing strong winds and waves, they had never seen such a scene. They stood beside the carriage and were stunned. Not only were these imperial guards stunned, but Emperor Chen was also stunned. As an emperor, he has never seen so much silver, so many white flowers, silver shining in the sun. Although more than 10 million taels of silver passed through his hands every year, those were just cold numbers on the memorial, far less shocking than the 3 million taels of silver placed in front of him. A small as who could transport back 300 taels of silver, so wouldn't the entire Jiangnan be able to transport back at least 10 years' worth of tax money to Chen State? Now that the pressure in the northwest has increased sharply, if the imperial court had all this money, would it be afraid that it would not have enough money to fight a war? Just using money can kill the barbarians in the western regions and grasslands. Thinking of this, Chen Huang licked his lips and his eyes flashed. Everyone was waiting for Emperor Chen to speak. A young eunuch stood beside him and couldn't help but remind him, "Your Majesty, Your Majesty." Emperor Chen finally came to his senses, thought for a while, and said, "Send all the silver to the inner palace." The inner palace is different from the national treasury. The money from the national treasury is used for the world. The inner palace is responsible for the daily use of the royal family. The emperor can spend the money from the inner palace however he wants, but the money from the national treasury cannot be used by the emperor at will. Returning to the imperial study room again, Chen Huang was pacing in the palace, unable to suppress the smile on his face. After a long time, he stopped, looked at the sharp blade captain again, and asked, "What else did Tang Ning ask you to bring?" The team leader said, "Master Tang also brought a copy of the Book of 10,000 People, which has the signatures and handprints of the people of Ezhu. The book lists in detail the evidence of the local officials of Ezhu preying on the people, disregarding the court's laws and regulations, and murdering the court officials." Emperor Chen said with a solemn face, "Send it up." The sharp blade captain respectfully handed over a handwritten letter. This memorial was written by Tang Ning himself, clearly recording the crimes of Ezhu officials. The last sentence was his guess that Liang's all things withered poison would be in the hands of Ezhu officials. Tang Ning guessed that there is some collusion with the Jiangnan gang. After a while, Chen Huang threw the memorial in his hand to the ground, his face turned completely gloomy, and he said angrily, "They are so brave." Jingzhou Mansion Office. Zhou Mingli was handling official business in the government office, when suddenly a government servant came forward to report that his wife and young lady had arrived. Zhou Mingli stood up and saw Chen Yuxian and Zhou Yisu are you walking in from outside. He walked out and asked in surprise, "Why are you here?" Chen Yuxian walked forward quickly and asked with concern, "Did something happen to Ning Er?" Zhou Mingli looked at her and asked, "Have you heard any rumors? Didn't I tell you to stay at home these days and not go out to listen to the gossip?" "What rumors?" Chen Yuxian looked at him and said angrily, "The whole capital is saying that Prime Minister Feng and the others are going to force His Majesty to get rid of the traitor." "Who is that traitor? Is he talking about Ning Er?" Zhou Mingli said, "His Majesty is protecting him, so you don't have to worry." Chen Yuxian said, "They all said that it was because His Majesty protected him that Prime Minister Feng and the others would not give up. Ning Er is in Jiangnan, so he won't be in any danger, right?" "Don't worry." Zhou Mingli looked at them and comforted, "As long as he is not recalled to the capital, nothing will happen." Chen Yuxian heard the implication of his words and asked hurriedly, "What if he is recalled to the capital?" Zhou Mingli opened his mouth, but finally said nothing. Prime Minister Feng and his group were determined to punish Tang Ning for the Jiangnan matter. If His Majesty hadn't protected him in a way that was almost evasive, he would have been recalled to the capital long ago. If he is recalled to the capital, it means that His Majesty has compromised in the face of the pressure from Prime Minister Feng and the Jiangnan party. After all, one is a young official who has just entered the officialdom, and the other is headed by the current right Prime Minister, the largest party group in the court. It is clear at a glance which one is more important to His Majesty and to the court. Zhou Mingli clenched his fists, but there was a deep look of helplessness in his eyes. This level of confrontation was far beyond the control of Jing Ziyin. Tomorrow is the deadline for recessing the court. One day later, there will be a bloody storm in the court surrounding this matter. While Zhou Mingli sighed, Fang Hong, a member of the staff, looked at a letter with a shocked expression. At the door of Xiao's residence, Xiao Ju opened the letter in his hand. After reading it, a strange smile appeared on his face. Above the Golden Palace. During his reign, His Majesty was extremely diligent. Except for the end of each year, he rarely had 10 consecutive days off for morning court. All the officials are well aware of the reason for the suspension of the imperial court this time. In order to avoid Prime Minister Feng and others' pursuit of Tang Ning, His Majesty simply turned a blind eye and hid in the palace on the pretext of being ill. He did not see anyone and tried to use this method was used to make Feng Xiang and others compromise. But perhaps even His Majesty did not expect that his move not only did not make Prime Minister Feng want to retreat, but also made him more determined to get rid of the emperor's favorite. Today's court may become a battlefield again. A drama of conflict between king and minister was staged. At the beginning of the morning court, civil and military officials slowly entered from outside the palace and stood waiting in the palace with their heads lowered. A quarter of an hour later, Emperor Chen came around from the back hall and sat on the dragon chair. He looked down and said, "What do you have to report today?" According to convention, after the emperor asked this question, the prime minister with the highest status among the officials would report some major events, followed by the 6 ministers. The officials would report what should be reported, what should be listened to, and what needed to be discussed according to their rank and position. Where, the emperor would let all officials discuss it freely. However, today, Prime Minister Wang asked for leave, and Prime Minister Feng said nothing. The 6 ministers also looked at their noses and their hearts, and had no intention of standing up. Most of the officials in the court kept silent at the right time. Everyone knew that today's morning court was the stage for His Majesty Feng Xianghe. Who else dared to intervene? After the courtiers were silent for a while, it was finally the turn of Liu Bu to give the matter. Li Ke took a step forward and bowed, "Your Majesty, the governor of Ezhu and other officials have arrived in Beijing. Tang Ning, the deputy minister of the Ministry of Official Affairs, has overstepped his authority and acted lawlessly. He has made the whole Jiangnan a mess and has caused widespread resentment among the people. I request Your Majesty's orders to send Tang Ning to the capital. Recall the capital to investigate." The courtiers raised their heads and glanced at Li Kegui Shizhong in unison. Li Kegui Shizhong mentioned this topic again, which was the beginning of today's court battle. Sure enough, after he finished speaking, another supervisory censor stood up and said, "Your Majesty, Tang Ning, the acting minister of the Ministry of Civil Affairs, was on his way to take exams in Jiangnan. Without the permission of the imperial court, he actually took the censor Zhong Cheng who was accompanying him to supervise him. He was arrested and imprisoned for acting arbitrarily and disrespecting the law. I beg Your Majesty to recall Tang Ning to the capital for questioning." "I second the proposal." Seconded. After supervising the censor, more than 10 people came out with uniform voices. Before Prime Minister Feng takes action, some officials from Prime Minister Feng's party have already gained such momentum. If His Majesty still insists on going his own way, it will be His Majesty who will be unable to come to power after the Jiangnan party collectively forces remonstrance. Zhou Mingli stood in the crowd, looking at these people with worry on his face. Fang Hong looked indifferent. Xiao Ju's eyes swept over everyone's faces one by one, and remembered their names one by one. Above the Golden Palace, all the officials had to lower their heads to report. No one dared to look up at the emperor, so no one saw. At this moment, Emperor Chen looked at the Jiangnan party in the palace with eyes full of disgust. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 570. Remember it in 1 second and read wonderful novels for free without pop-ups. The annual income of Chen Guo's treasury, excluding physical items, was equivalent to only 10 million taels of silver. A small Ezhu in the south of the Yangtze River deceived the emperor, colluded with officials and businessmen, and plotted to murder the imperial officials. In one exam, the tax money and stolen goods were recovered, equivalent to more than 5 million taels, accounting for half of the national treasury. He had known for a long time that there was a problem in Jiangnan, but he didn't know that there was such a big deal. Jiangnan officials were so arrogant. It was because they were supported by these people in the court. The source of the chaos in Jiangnan was not in Jiangnan, but in the Golden Palace. These people took advantage of the imperial court's salary, but separated the imperial court from Jiangnan. They only cared about their own interests and became the worms of the imperial court. Without the 3 million taels of silver, he could still turn a blind eye to the actions of these people. Eyes, now there is only disgust. Chen Huang looked down calmly and said, I asked him to go to Jiangnan, and I also gave him the Shangfang sword. Seeing the sword is like seeing the king. Why, he can't deal with the Ezhu officials, why can't I deal with him? Li Ke said sternly, even if he has Shangfang's sword, it is not the reason for him to act recklessly in the south of the Yangtze River. Tang Ning relied on His Majesty's trust to cause trouble to the place and make the people of Ezhu miserable. Isn't it an added crime? The supervisory censor said, Your Majesty, the censorship department sent people to accompany the Ministry of Personnel examination. This was originally to supervise the officials of the Ministry of Personnel. However, as soon as Tang Ning arrived in Jiangnan, she acted arbitrarily and sent back the censor Zhong Cheng. Isn't this right? Does it mean there's something wrong with him? Your Majesty, Tang Ning must be recalled. I second the proposal. I second the proposal. After Li Ke spoke to the censor of the incident and supervision, the officials from the Jiangnan faction who stood up began to speak in unison. Until a figure stood up, everyone closed their mouths at the same time. Prime Minister Feng came out, bowed and said, The sword Shangfang is extraordinary. This is a big deal. Since the founding of the Chen dynasty, there has never been a precedent for giving it to a minister. No matter how much your Majesty favors and trusts his ministers, he cannot set a precedent. If someone uses the power of the sword to harm the place, wouldn't it also undermine His Majesty's majesty? Emperor Chen looked at him and asked, Where did Prime Minister Feng hear that Tang Ning used the Shangfang sword I gave him to harm the place? Your Majesty gave him the Shangfang sword, which is the ultimate expression of a king's favor and trust in his ministers. Feng Xiang did not answer the question, but instead said, But as a king, no matter what, you cannot favor only one person. Qin Tu only favored Zhao Gao, and De Qin it led to the destruction of the country. Emperor Xianzong of the Tang dynasty favored concubine Yang, and the Tang dynasty turned from prosperity to decline. There are countless examples in ancient times that caused great disasters because of kings' exclusive favors. Is your Majesty going to follow in the footsteps of those monarchs? Prime Minister Feng's words were already a very stern admonishment for the king. Although he did not say it explicitly, everyone could understand the meaning behind his words. If your Majesty recalls Tang Ning, he will be a wise king who knows his mistakes and can correct them. If he is stubborn, he will be no different from the foolish kings in history. Above the court, only Prime Minister Feng can say this and dares to say this. All the officials lowered their heads and slowed down their breathing. In the past, when encountering this kind of situation, His Majesty had to have a big quarrel with Prime Minister Feng in the court. When gods fight, they little devils will avoid it if they can, and hide if they can. But this time, they waited for a long time and did not wait for His Majesty to get angry. Some people had quietly looked up. The expression on Chen Wang's face was very calm, and he asked, Does Prime Minister Feng mean that I am a foolish king? I don't dare. Feng Xiang bowed and said, It's just that I'm old and frail, and I've always been unable to deal with court affairs recently. Since your Majesty has already found a capable minister, I would like to ask your Majesty to allow me to return home after serving." Everyone could hear that Prime Minister Feng was speaking sarcastically. He was forcing His Majesty to choose between him and Tang Ning. This is also Prime Minister Feng's trick that has been tried and tested time and time again. Even when other ministers are old, His Majesty has to keep them again, let alone the right minister. Whenever Prime Minister Feng used this move, even if His Majesty did not yield, he would always give in. They secretly looked at Chen Huang and found that he was standing there stunned, with an expression on his face. Was this an expression of surprise on His Majesty's face? After yesterday, Chen Huang's dissatisfaction and disgust with Jiangnan officials had reached its peak. As for Jiangnan officials, most of them were headed by Prime Minister Feng. It was precisely because of Prime Minister Feng's existence that some of his decrees for Jiangnan could not be implemented at all. But even if he is dissatisfied with Prime Minister Feng, he cannot remove him. This is a power that although he has, he cannot exercise it casually. In this case, what Feng Xiang said just now was exactly what he wanted and spoke to his heart. He suppressed the joy in his heart, thought for a moment, nodded and said, "Prime Minister Feng has worked hard for the country all his life, so he deserves a good rest. I agree with your request." Prime Minister Feng raised his head suddenly, regardless of the etiquette of monarchs and ministers, and looked at Emperor Chen in disbelief. It shouldn't be like this, things definitely shouldn't be like this. Resigning is just a bargaining chip for him to force His Majesty to make concessions. How could His Majesty agree to it? How could he agree to it? He opened his mouth, but there seemed to be a ball of cotton stuck in his throat, and he couldn't speak. It was not only Prime Minister Feng who was shocked, but also all the courtiers in the palace. After Emperor Chen finished speaking, a shocking uproar broke out in the court hall. "His Majesty! Your Majesty, you must not! I beg your Majesty to take back your order. Does your Majesty really want to cause chaos in the imperial court and destroy the country because of a sycophant?" This time, it was not only officials from the Jiangnan faction who knelt down, but almost half of the court officials in the hall knelt down. Being dismissed from the position of Prime Minister was a big deal. Although it was Prime Minister Feng who resigned himself, everyone knew that this was not his intention. The two Prime Ministers were like the two pillars of the court. If one fell, how could the court be stable? Officials could ignore the affairs of Jiangnan and watch the fun, but if His Majesty wanted to dismiss the Prime Minister, they could not stand idly by. Flatterers, Emperor Chen looked at them, smiled, and asked, "Do you know what those Ezhu local officials did?" After he spoke, the court immediately became quiet. Emperor Chen looked at them and asked, "They colluded with officials and businessmen to embezzle the tax silver of the court. Do you know how much tax silver Tang Ning recovered from Ezhu this time? 5 million taels, a full 5 million taels." Emperor Chen raised his voice and looked at a person standing in front of the court and said, "Qianchuo." Minister of the Ministry of Revenue Qianchuo stepped forward and said, "I am here." Emperor Chen looked at him and asked, "Tell them how much tax silver the treasury collected last year." Qianchuo thought for a while and said, "Your Majesty, in the first year of Ding Yuan, the money deposited into the treasury was equivalent to about 10 million taels of silver." "Did you hear that?" Emperor Chen looked at the officials and said sternly, 10 million taels, the tax silver of the treasury is only 10 million taels a year, and as small as who hides half of the treasury. You all know how to ask me for money, and after all this time, I am the poorest." Emperor Chen's voice was almost a roar, and the officials were silent. "Do you think this is the end?" Emperor Chen walked up to the upper room, took out a thick letter, threw it in the face of the Li Kji Shizhong, and cursed, "This is a letter from the people of Ezhu, which lists dozens of crimes of Ezhu officials. Tell me, who is causing chaos in the local area?" Li Kji Shizhong looked pale, trembling, and knelt on the ground, not daring to speak. Emperor Chen threw another memorial at the face of the supervisory censor and said in a deep voice, 2 years ago, Censor Zheng went to Ezhu to investigate the mining tax, but died of acclimatization. You should remember it, right? Without waiting for his answer, Emperor Chen snorted coldly and said, of course you remember, you should remember, because it was you who replaced him. He looked at the ministers and raised his voice again. He is the flatterer you are talking about. He recovered 5 million taels of tax silver for the court. He redressed the grievances of the people of Ezhu. He found out that the supervisory censor who died in Ezhu 2 years ago did not die of illness, but was murdered by Ezhu officials. Your Majesty was obviously angry, and the officials kneeling on the ground lowered their heads and dared not say a word. Emperor Chen walked up again, and while all the officials were looking down and no one was paying attention, he secretly opened Tang Ning's letter and read it, then closed it, paced back down, and said sternly, I used to think that the enemies of my Chen state were in the grasslands, in the western regions, but now I am becoming more and more clear that the enemies of my great Chen are not in the north or the west, but in this court, in this golden palace. Accusing loyal people as traitors, protecting criminal officials, forming cliques for personal gain, forcing the emperor in the golden palace, which one of these was not done by you? You just talked to me about Zhao Gao, tell me, you and Zhao Gao, what's the difference? When you were fighting in the capital, the flatterer you called was collecting taxes for me and redressing the grievances for the people. When you stand here and accuse him, don't you feel a little ashamed? I am very sad, I am very disappointed in you. Emperor Chen glanced at everyone again, sighed, and said, kneel down for me, kneel for half an hour, kneel here, touch your conscience, and think about it for me. After that, he walked straight out of the hall. Seeing this, Wei Jian hurried down and followed him closely. Emperor Chen's face was as gloomy as water. He walked out of the hall, walked through 2 long corridors, walked to a deserted place, stopped, the anger on his face was gone, and laughed up to the sky, it's great. Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 571. Above the Golden Palace, even though Emperor Chen had left, there was still silence. From the Prime Minister to the 6 minor officials, and even the eunuchs serving in the palace, all knelt down. When the Emperor is angry, millions of corpses will be laid down and blood will flow for thousands of miles. Your Majesty's thunderous anger just now will not lay down millions of corpses and bleed for thousands of miles, but it still shakes the whole court. Prime Minister Feng pretended to resign, but His Majesty did not object, but followed the trend and really allowed him to resign and return home. This was unexpected by everyone and is still unbelievable to this day. But thinking about His Majesty's words that still seemed to be echoing in the palace, it seemed that everything was logical. The National Treasury's annual tax revenue is only 10 million taels. Ezhu, a small state in the south of the Yangtze River, hid half of the National Treasury. What about Jiangnan West Road and the whole of Jiangnan? They dare not imagine. What's more, Jiangnan officials were so bold that they wantonly murdered Beijing officials who went to Jiangnan to investigate, which touched the bottom line of the court. And the reason why they are so arrogant is precisely because Jiangnan has produced too many high-ranking officials, and it is precisely because the Jiangnan faction is the mainstay of the court. Now, this pillar has fallen. Now that your Majesty has dismissed Prime Minister Feng, he will not stop there. In the case of official affairs, a certain supervisory censor and the Jiangnan officials who just stepped forward to force His Majesty to make concessions may not be able to escape. Above the Golden Palace, hundreds of officials were kneeling on the ground, and people were in panic. Prime Minister Feng was kneeling at the front, as if his spine had been ripped out, and his whole body was bowed down. Many officials secretly sighed in their hearts. Prime Minister Feng had worked hard for the country all his life, but in the end he still did not have a happy ending. He rose because of Jiangnan, and was tired of Jiangnan, and his lifelong fame was ruined. They subconsciously looked to the other side, only to realize that Prime Minister Wang did not go to court today. Prime Minister Feng was deposed, and Prime Minister Wang was the only backbone of everyone. Just when the officials were punished to kneel in the Golden Palace, outside the capital, under the weeping willows by the river, the old man sat on a low stool and looked at the water leisurely. Even if the front of the fishing rod shook violently, it was as steady as a mountain. Sitting. A little girl ran over, shook his arm and said, "Grandpa, don't sleep, the fish is hooked." Grandpa didn't sleep. The left Prime Minister smiled and shook his head. He lifted the fishing rod and found nothing on the hook. The little girl said angrily, "The fish ran away." The old man touched her head and said with a smile, "The fish here are very smart. They can even catch people. It's not easy to catch them." The little girl looked at her and frowned. Grandpa is so confused. How can a fish catch a person? Wang Xiang laughed and said, "You are still young. When you grow up, you will know that fish can also catch people. It is not easy to see who is a fish and who is a person." Thinking that fish could also turn into humans, the little girl looked at the river water with a frightened expression on her face, and hurriedly turned around and ran away. A few feet away on the other side of the river, Zhao Yuan took back his fishing rod, and there was a palm-sized fish hanging on the hook. He looked at the little girl and asked, "Sister Wang, are you coming to see me fishing?" "I'm fishing with Grandpa, who asked you to come with me." The little girl snorted and said, "Go and let your sisters from the Zhang family and Bai family watch you fishing." Zhao Yuan said innocently, "I just like to show you." The little girl put her hands on her hips and said, "You also said you would marry them when you grow up." Zhao Yuandao, "But I also said I want to marry you." The little girl said angrily, "You can only choose one." A look of defeat appeared on Zhao Yuan's face, and he threw the fishhook back into the water with an envious expression on his face. "My husband already has 3 mistresses, and my father also has many concubines. I heard that so many women like my husband because he is the #1 scholar, and my father has so many concubines because he is the emperor and can marry whomever he wants." Zhao Yuan thought about it seriously and felt that it would be better to let him die than to let him take the #1 exam. In comparison, being an emperor seemed easier. Thinking of this, he dropped his fishing rod and ran towards the palace. The little girl watched him leave with his guards. After being stunned, she shouted, "Where are you going?" At this time, officials came out one after another from the palace. The officials had different expressions, but the same thing was that they all limped when they came out, as if all the civil and military officials were suffering from leg disease, which attracted pedestrians passing by the palace entrance to stop and watch. Zhou Mingli did not go to the Jingzhou government office, but limped back home. Chen Yuxian and others had been waiting at the door for a long time. When they saw him coming from a distance, they hurriedly stepped forward and asked worriedly, "What are you doing? What's wrong? Did your Majesty also punish you?" "Ninger is fine, and so am I." Zhou Mingli shook his head and said, "Go in and talk." A moment later, in the palace, Chen Yuxian looked at him, confused. "You said that His Majesty dismissed the Prime Minister and made everyone kneel in the court for half an hour. Not only the Prime Minister, but more than 10 officials from Jiangnan have been dismissed and will never be hired." Zhou Mingli recalled the scene in the morning and was a little frightened. He said, "Corruption is rampant in Jiangnan. In Ezhu alone, Ninger is pursuing." After receiving 5 million taels of silver, the Jiangnan officials were still struggling with each other in the court. His Majesty was furious and severely reprimanded all the civil and military officials in the court today. Zhou Nyisuaryu was relieved, but Chen Yuxian was still a little uneasy and asked, "They won't make trouble again, will they? Even Prime Minister Feng has been dismissed, why are they still making trouble?" Zhou Mingli shook his head and said, "The strength of the Jiangnan party has been seriously damaged this time, and I am afraid it will not recover for a long time. This is 5 million taels of silver, who can give it back. If they dare to make trouble again, they will not even risk their lives. Rich man Tang stood aside, raised his eyebrows, and asked, "Is 5 million taels a lot?" Zhong Mingli glanced at him, breathed a sigh of relief, and said, "Anyway, this matter is finally over. I told you not to worry." Rich man Tang looked at him and said, "Your own uncle doesn't even understand him. What has he ever suffered in anything?" Imperial study room. Emperor Chen sat above him and said, "Give me a seat." Several ministers and important ministers knelt for half an hour. It was difficult to stand here at this moment. After hearing this, they immediately raised their hands and said, "Thank you, Your Majesty." A young eunuch brought chairs and several people sat down one after another. After everyone sat down, Chen Huang looked at an old man and said, "Prime Minister Feng has resigned and retired. The position of Right Minister should be temporarily taken over by Zhou Iking. Zhou Shangshu, the Ministry of Civil Affairs, is already old, several years older than Prime Minister Feng. In the past 2 years, his health has been declining, and he has the intention of resigning. At this time, the Emperor entrusted him with the important task of Right Minister. Naturally, it's not about letting him carry the court again. This is actually a kind of honor. These veterans who have made significant contributions to the imperial court will be granted a certain degree of title before taking up their official positions. They do not hold real power, and they only serve for a few months, and the longest is no more than a year, but they are also a kind of perfection in official career. Even 100 years later, if another sentence is engraved on the tombstone, "Official to the right Prime Minister of the dynasty," it will sound better than the official minister. Zhou Shangshu stood up holding the chair, bowed his hands, and said, "Old Minister, thank you for your grace." Chen Huang nodded and said, "Dr. Yushi." The imperial censor became energetic and said, "I am here. Chen Huangdao, I ordered Yashitai and Dali Temple to investigate the matter in Ezhu. You will give me an explanation within 3 days." The imperial censor solemnly said, "I obey the order." The supervisory censor was killed in Ezhu. Even if Emperor Chen didn't tell the censor would not let it go. What's more, this time the censor Zhong Chen made the censor lose face in front of His Majesty and all the officials. He still had to find a way pick it up. Chen Huang made some arrangements before looking at everyone again and asked, "What else do you want to report?" Qianzhuo, the Minister of Household Affairs, thought of something, stood up and said, "Your Majesty, the Treasury has no extra income this year. Regarding the 5 million taels of silver recovered by Mr. Tang from Ezhu." Chen Huang raised his eyebrows and said, "The money thing is not important." Qianzhuo was startled and said, "Your Majesty, 5 million taels is already half of the national treasury's tax revenue. With these 5 million taels, the national treasury..." Boom. Chen Huang slapped the table and stood up, pointed at him, and said angrily, "You also know that 5 million taels of silver is half of the national treasury's tax money. How did you become the minister of the Ministry of Revenue, and how did you collect the tax money in Jiangnan? I just gave you face in the Golden Palace. Don't think that I am very satisfied with your household department, but you reminded me that from now on, all the officials of your household department will be fined for half a year." Qianzhuo looked stunned and innocent, and murmured, "Your Majesty." Chen Huang said loudly, "If you dare to quibble, you will be fined for 1 year." Qianzhuo looked at him, seemed to have thought of something, and shut his mouth honestly. This chapter is first published like Have Voice Novel Network. Please remember the URL.